Like always, the preseason brought a massive shift in the meta with it, but especially so for junglers. With nerfs to counter jungling and shared experience gained from minions, as well as the overall normalization in jungle clear speed, it's widely accepted that it's better now than ever to turn your brain off and just full clear every game. It's harder to get leads from things that aren't your camps, which results in camps being the strongest thing to do the majority of the time. We will see this reflected in the popularity and win rate of all the top champions right now, as the top 10 list on OPGG is full of champs that just love to power farm. There's a huge lack of playstyle diversity at the moment, which for a lot of people can feel, well, boring. If you share this sentiment, don't worry, you're not alone. Variety is the spice of life, and when one playstyle is clearly better than others, things can get a bit stale. Luckily, there is one player in particular that thinks that everyone else has it wrong, and swears that the meta actually isn't as defined as we think. And if you want to be ahead of the meta with guides just like this one that are exclusive to our members, then you should definitely check out Skillcapped after this. It's famous for how stupidly effective our guides are, and we're also known as the only service that offers a rank up guarantee, because our service works and we believe you shouldn't pay if you don't climb while actively using Skillcapped. So check us out after this. But before we get into exactly how he's breaking the preseason meta, let's tell you who he is. itemization is an Elise one-trick and 1000 LP challenger player that has been having insane success in the preseason, while playing a champion that many would probably expect to suffer in such a seemingly farming-dominated space. He employs simple strategies in the early game that you can use every game to find leads. For example, he always 3 camps in his games. If starting at red buff, you will do red raptors and then gromp. And if starting at blue buff, you will do blue gromp into red. This is because everyone else is full clearing so much more now, and because of it, you're more likely than ever to always have something to do. Let's listen to his thoughts about this really quickly.
It doesn't matter the lane state, whether it's pushing, even pushing the other way. It doesn't matter where the jungler is. There's literally always something you can do. There's always something you can find because she is able to tower dive at level 3. Even if the enemy bot lane is almost full HP, you can still dive.
No matter how his lanes are doing, he feels like he's always able to find a play. And this is in part from 2 things that he makes sure to do every game. The first is just getting a ward on the enemy red buff. Some Elises will start Q for clear speed reasons, but itemization always makes sure to start W just for this strategy. Before turning the corner into the opponent's red buff, you can place your W, which will scout out the bush and provide you vision so that you can avoid face checking the enemy team. Now he can get in and ward the opponent's red. Afterwards, you just recall and switch to sweeper. This will let you confirm one of 2 scenarios. If you see the enemies starting at their red, you know that they're pathing towards their blue. And if you don't see them, you can probably assume that they're pathing towards their red after starting blue. This is important so that you know what to do once you actually finish your 3 camps.
So if the enemy is pushing into my bot lane, I can obviously gank if they don't have a ward, or I can walk around the ward, whatever. If my bot lane is pushing and the enemy jungle is, on the same side as me, then I can call them to invade. And if the jungle's on the opposite side, a lot of people might be like, okay, well, there's nothing to do. But with Elise specifically, it's like, that's like the ideal situation is enemy jungle is opposite side of the map, my bot lane's pushing, and I just go and dive.
By finding the enemy's location early, you'll know when to avoid going for an early gank that just might get countered by the enemy jungler, and you can just invade them instead. Or you can sometimes just counter gank them. If they're on the other side of the map, then Elise's unique strengths let you tower dive unconditionally and always get a gank off regardless of if the lane is pushed or pushing. On Elise in particular, playing the ganks well is super critical, as a lot of people will mess up and ruin their success rate just by wasting cocoon early. If you aren't behind your opponent, simply walk up in spider form and lead by repelling onto them. This lets you use human E if they flash or dash away, and you can still catch them with hard CC. If you're already behind them, then walk up in human form and simply use red buff autos and Qs to bait out their escapes before committing your cocoon and spider form combo. Once you blow summoners from a lane, it's incredibly important to immediately return to the lane and punish the lack of sums. Doing this will usually result in easy kills, and while this does have one weakness, the preseason actually just nerfed it. When doing this sort of gank, you're ignoring your opposite side camps that are respawning around 410, and choosing to ignore them for the gank. The counterplay for your opponent is to now invade for those camps and steal them away. But since counter jungling takes 20% longer now, and they can't leave behind a little raptor or wolf to mess up your clear, you're not nearly as punished for this as you were in the past, and it takes longer for them to do it while you make their teammates' lives hell. He really just tries to make one lane rage quit and puts a ton of his resources into making sure that they get ahead. But actually picking the lane to do that for is one of the other really important things.
If you're not selective and you're not like planning ahead, then you might path from bot lane, like your blue buff, and then path up, and it might be into tank v tank matchup and you can't dive that, right? And then we'll shoot. Yeah, now you can't do anything because you weren't planning ahead, and instead of pathing to, like a hook bot lane or something that's more aggressive, you path into a pretty passive lane that, can't utilize your early game strength.
He looks for lanes that are super volatile or able to utilize his early pressure. Ignite top laners, as well as melee bruisers like Fiora, Aurelia, Aatrox, all snowball and rely on early leads to take over games. These are the kinds of matchups you want to look for if you're trying to go towards top lane. For bot lane, look for snowballing ADCs like Draven or Caitlyn, as well as supports that will provide CC or hard engage like Thresh or Blitzcrank. Picking which lane you want to gank and then starting on the opposite side of the map is vital if you want to have success on Elise, as if you mess up in the early stages of the game, you don't really scale well into the late game. However, the whole point of Elise is to make these aggressive plays and snowball hard so that you don't reach late game at all, or if you do, that you're significantly ahead for a number of reasons. Everything that iMissMyQ does, from playstyle to runes to builds, is focused on snowballing. For example, some Elises will opt to go for Electrocute or PTA in their runes, but he doesn't recommend this at all. He opts for a few things that are outside the norm. First is actually choosing Alacrity in his secondary tree over Coup de Grace. While Coup does provide early damage, Alacrity scales much better and gains bonuses for champion kills, which he is pretty much banking on. On top of this, he goes for Treasure Hunter instead of Relentless Hunter, and Dark Harvest over Electrocute or PTA for the extra incentive for kills. Part of this is because he knows that his ganks or dives are going to work out, and he wants to transition to mid-game with a solid enough lead in order to execute his mid-game plans. And the other part of it is also just because the first base and item buys are super important. Elise spikes incredibly hard on Sorc shoes, so our main goal is to get a kill, proc Treasure Hunter, and get 1100 gold in order to afford boots too. In comparison to tier 1 boots, tier 2 boots are much better due to the actual combat stats that they give, and they help you move around the map faster to make it to ganks and dives on time. Ideally, if your first couple of minutes are really great, you can even pick up a Dark Seal on top of this, which will increase the value of any kills you're going to pick up even more. Of course, you're not always going to get enough gold, and in that case, you can't afford Sorc shoes. Now he just recommends to just go Dark Seal and Amp Tome, as boots 1 are really not that good. Dark Seal is a core item early on due to its insane gold efficiency, and once again, we're playing for that snowball and banking on picking up kills in the early game. If you get used to playing Elise, you're probably going to get pretty fed early on, but there's always a complaint that many players have after this.
And one of the things a lot of people in lower elo complain to me about is I get so fed on Elise, and I can't, I always lose, my team always throws, but it's because they're not actually like playing to end the game.
This problem is a massive one, and one that is solved by having a very solid game plan in mid-game. The best way to close the game is to highly prioritize neutral objectives like Dragon and Rift Herald, and since Elise is so strong early and you hopefully got a lane ahead, you'll have a major advantage that a lot of champions just don't. Starting at level 4, Elise is easily capable of soloing Dragon. You don't need to rely on your team at all to help, and at level 5, the rate at which you can take Dragon increases by an even larger margin. One of the main goals iMissMyQ has is removing this first Dragon from the map before 8 minutes. Why is that timer important? Well, it's when Rift Herald first spawns. Because of Elise's strong early game, you don't want to allow your opponents to get uncontested objectives that might drag the game out. If you allow them to take Herald while you do Dragon, then you're going to be relatively even and also losing potential to snowball. They get progress to the rough early game that they should have while facing Elise, and also get closer to endgame where you are going to struggle. However, Dragon spawns at 5 minutes and Rift Herald doesn't spawn till 8, leaving a 3-minute window where only one objective is up for either team to contest. It's these 3 minutes that are so crucial. You can make it so that when Herald comes up, your opponent can't take Dragon while you're doing it. They're often just left with counter jungling as a counterplay, which, as we've talked about, has been nerfed.
Since it's harder to invade and take camps, Elise never really took camps in the first place compared to other junglers, so anything that nerfs enemies taking camps is good for you, right? You gank, and they can't take your camps as fast. You take dragon, they can't take your camps as fast. So taking that dragon while they can't answer with Rift is great, because once you do that, then as Rift starts to come up, you can pull your support. You can even type, hey, pretty please, support, can you come take Rift with me? I think it's important to involve your teammates, because whether they listen or not, you got to at least try to shepherd them. Because,
I'd agree.
Yeah. So, because that's what I always tell people too. I tell them you need to be, you're like the shepherd, and your teammates are the sheep, right? You have to do your best to lead them and tell them what to do, because they don't know what they're doing, right?
Staggering these objective spawns allows you to abuse your early game strength by forcing opponents away from the objective while simultaneously not allowing them any counterplay, and it leads to you being able to push your lead to actually try and close the game sooner. Fair warning though, to not get too carried away even if you get fed. One of the main downfalls of Elise is when you don't play cleanly and throw your lead. Because of the way shutdowns, catch-up XP, and objective bounties work, you've got to be very aware of your limits and how much you can actually do without throwing. Elise can't risk messing up and allowing the game to drag out, so you have to constantly be disciplined and know when to pull back.
You're taking as much as you possibly can while giving away as little as you can. Like if you get an ace, and then you go and you get a turret, and then you get an inhibitor, and then you all die, and then the enemy goes and gets Baron. It's like, wow, you got a lot, but wow, you gave away way more, right? So you have to know when to, you have to get as much as you possibly can, but you have to know when to pull back as well.
Hopefully, you never actually get to late game, since Elise tends to struggle here more than in other stages of the game. But it's not completely hopeless if you do. Elise's damage output in the late game is still extremely respectable. It's not that she falls off in that regard, as she's an excellent assassin, but it's because the way she kills targets tends to become more difficult as the game drags on. Elise needs to be able to actually reach a priority target in order to kill them. And most of the time, you can't just repel onto a carry, since you want to be starting in human form first to get max damage. Ideally, you'll look for picks by sitting in bushes that have been swept, as vision control on Elise is incredibly important. And if your team wants to group up, you just really shouldn't join them. Don't run mid and group. Try to predict where your team will want to go and get there first so that you can find a pick. If you see a red buff that's about to spawn, go try and bush cheese. You can also predict where the enemy laners will need to go in order to group up. If you see someone farming bot and the rest of their team is grouping mid, you can just go into the bot side jungle with your sweeper on and pick the laner as they try to regroup. Once you find a pick, the team fight becomes a 4v5 and you guarantee that you'll still be able to win even if your teammates end. Again, you ideally need to be leading in human form at this point in the game if you want max damage, and that means you're going to just have to walk at your opponents, which is going to be extremely difficult in a 5v5 teamfight scenario. But there is one solution.
Maybe you and your teammate that's off somewhere else can maybe get behind them, but you want to get that flank so that, because you're not going to be able to get through a tank. You can't walk through an Ornn and a Syndra and Braum. You can't walk through that. But if you just walk behind them, and then you can just, whether it's flash on them, whether it's peek out from a bush, throw a stun, whatever you do, you want that direct line to their backline carries.
Elise wants to avoid 5v5 fights like the plague. But if you do find yourself having to fight them because your opponents are bunching up and you just can't find the pick, you cannot approach the fight from the front. Sneak around or stay on the side of the fight out of vision, and let the enemy team walk past you so you have access to the backline and all of the important targets. You absolutely cannot try and repel on your targets except as a finishing move. Repel is by far your most important tool in the late game and is used to stall for time in fights more than anything else. As an aside, Smartcast is absolutely required so that you can do the instant drop on your targets. If you don't Smartcast, you'll have to initially press E to go in the air and then E again on your target to drop down. But if your target leaves range before your second E, you'll be stuck in the air unable to reach them. Smartcast E immediately goes up into the air and drops onto the target, but it will not even go into the air if it cannot also drop down, meaning that you can't mess up and will always reach your target. The only downside with Smartcast is that it's harder to intentionally stay in the air to stall, say if you accidentally click a minion or something and you'll immediately drop down. The way around this is to use the self-cast keybind, which is defaulted to Alt on the keyboard. You can press Alt and E, and this will always put Elise into the air without ever dropping down. The combination of using Smartcast E and Self-Cast E will make it so that your repels always do what you actually want them to do. The utility of this spell doesn't end here though. Throughout the entire game, I Miss My Q will actively avoid using jungle plants, since while Repel is versatile, it does need a target to drop down onto. Learning the spawn timers and locations of jungle plants allows easy escapes and chases from situations that seem impossible otherwise. Every time you kill a plant, you have to weigh the cost benefit of removing some versatility from your Repel and limiting your movement. It's worth it sometimes, but definitely worth thinking about before you mindlessly hit those plants. While Elise is relatively straightforward combo-wise, she does have some interesting ability interactions that are good to know about, mostly with her human W. As an Elise main myself, it's great to know just the little ins and outs of the champion to get a little bit more damage where you can. In a situation where you can get maximum DPS, it's best to lead with W and not with Q. Because human Q does percentage health damage, you might think that it's necessary to lead with it so that you can get maximum damage with it, but we need to remember the travel time of W. Because of its slow travel time, it's ideal to use W first to save time in your combo, and while it's moving to your opponent, you're actually able to cast E, Q, and an auto attack in order to get all of your burst out instantly, so you can immediately transition to spider form where your auto attacks are much more threatening. On top of this, human form W has a unique interaction where spider form Q causes it to lock on and fly to the target. This can be used to navigate the human W, which is a large amount of your burst damage, to the correct target. If you try to hit a target behind another and cast W, the first target in the line will block it and take the damage. However, if you aim your W to the side and then spider form Q onto your target, it jumps from its location straight to it, which allows you to get around champions that might try to block it and get your full burst damage onto your primary target. Of course, these little tricks go a long way to help with being able to win any matchup. And for the most part, Elise doesn't really have too many bad matchups. In fact, I Miss My Q says that if you have an AD mid and the opponent won't be buying early MR, that Elise doesn't really lose any at all. However, with an AP mid and early Merc Treads or Hex Drinkers coming out on the enemy team, life gets really difficult really quickly. Of course, he picks Elise every game it isn't picked or banned, and still has a great win rate, so it's obviously not a huge issue, but some matchups are definitely worse than others. He made a full matchup chart that details his opinions on all of the jungle champs you might find yourself against, and in general says that if you aren't one-tricking Elise, that picking her into the champions including and above the C tier is perfectly fine. If you're going to be one-tricking Elise and picking her no matter what, you can win the bad matchups, but Rengar is an absolute thorn in your side, and it's very rough even if you're super experienced, so it's probably best just to ban it. As far as builds go, he recommends going Sorc Shoes, Dark Seal, and Night Harvester every game. When picking a jungle pet, you really only can pick between blue or green at the moment, although it might change in the future. In general, he thinks blue is overall better for the insane pick potential that it gives you, and it's especially good into squishy teams that will die quickly. For teams that are tanky or have hard CC to lock you down, green is your best option, as it helps against champions that you'll have a hard time bursting in late game, and is also good due to the extra tenacity that it offers. For the second item, you have a few options. You need to determine if you're able to go on the offensive or if you need to be a bit more defensive in your build. Comps with only one type of damage source like all AD or AP teams makes building defense second a lot better, which in that case you'll opt for Zhonya's or Banshees. But in the case that your snowballing or defensive itemization doesn't seem universally good enough, you can pick between Lichbane, Shadow Flame, or Magi's. If you already have 10 stacks on Dark Seal and are super ahead, Magi's is great, but you definitely will not build Magi's in every single game. Dark Seal is an amazing item and he recommends it for every game as it's gold efficient even without upgrading it. In most cases, you'll just be building Lichbane second unless almost everyone on the enemy team can be one-shot by you. If everyone is super squishy, Shadow Flame provides better damage in the initial burst, but once the fight lasts longer than about 2 seconds, Lichbane will outperform, and it also has added utility in the other stats that it gives. For the most part, your standard build is going to be Night Harvester into Lichbane in 90% of games, but it's good to be on the lookout for the fringe cases. After your second item, you have a bit of versatility in what you can go, but he recommends Void, Rabadon's, Zhonya's, Banshee, and Rylai's as some of the best items to slot in here. His overall thoughts on all the items can be seen in his tier list here, and as you can see, there are some more niche items like Abyssal Mask and Frozen Heart that can be purchased if incredibly gold efficient in your particular game. Alright, before we wrap this up, let's tell you a little more about Skillcapped. We offer a 5-division rank up guarantee and think that's a pretty crazy thing to offer. It's like a gym membership guaranteeing you'll get ripped. Your local gym would go bust if they offered that, right? Not us. We've offered this for years because our service really does work. It works so well, in fact, that we're able to produce by far the largest catalog of premium league guides on the internet, We add over 20 videos a week with over 2,000 guides curated into over 270 courses. No one can compare. We've also sent challenger players into ELO hell over 1,100 times and counting, where they commentate how to carry live. They also respond to all your questions asked. Sign up today for as little as $6.99 a month to improve fast and get the rank you've always wanted. Link in the description below. But that's pretty much all you need to know to start playing Elise and really switch up the current playstyle that you might find yourself stuck in. iMissMyQ does think that other champions can work being piloted like this, but heavily prefers playing Elise just for her dive capabilities. It was definitely extremely interesting to see someone having success on a playstyle that seems polar opposite from what the vast majority of players are doing right now. And we want to thank him for his help in creating this guide. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you all in the next one.